Before you decide to use pesticides, you should understand pest management. This presentation covers the basic principles of pest management. We'll start with a quick historical perspective of pest problems and pest management practices. Human pests and plant pests were problems during the Dark Ages too. We'll also discuss the basic principles of integrated pest management, some key pests, and the problems they cause. This module will help you understand the importance of preventive and corrective measures. You'll become familiar with why it's important to monitor pest populations when implementing an IPM program and how environmental influences affect pest populations. Pesticide resistance and how it develops will also be covered in this module. After reading the core manual and hearing this presentation, you should be very familiar with the basic concepts of pest management, whether your pest control is targeted at moths on roofs of houses, barnacles on boat bottoms, weeds in forests, fungi in wheat, milfoil in waterways, termites in structures, or beetles in stored commodities. What is a pest? A pest is any organism that is unwanted by humans. Pests may be unwanted due to their destructive nature, the health concerns they pose, or because they're plain annoying. Insects are not the only kind of pest. Mites, plant pathogens, weeds, mollusks, fish, birds, and even some mammals can be pests. They can be found in waterways, agriculture, landscapes, roadsides, natural areas, stored food, schools, hospitals, and even swimming pools. Do you remember anything from your history lessons about Black Plague in Europe? During the 14th century, there were plague outbreaks. Millions of people died, and at the time it wasn't understood why. Centuries later, it was discovered that plague was a bacterial disease and it was spread by fleas found in rodent populations. Besides biting rats, infected fleas would bite humans and other mammals. Bubonic plague is still present in some rodent populations today, even here in the United States. But with rodent management and plague monitoring, only a few people a year are infected with plague. Plant diseases have been important in our history too. Late blight of potato is a fungal disease that was responsible for the Great Potato Famine in Ireland during the 19th century. Thousands of Irish people starved and more than 1 million migrated to the United States. The late blight fungus continues to be a major problem of potatoes around the world, but is now managed through the use of resistant cultivars, proper sanitation practices, and fungicides. Our ancestors controlled pests usually using brute force and manual labor. Thousands of years ago, chemicals that affected pests were discovered through trial and error. When sulfur was burned, it was found to affect insects and mites. Later, several other inorganic materials, like lead and arsenate, were used as pesticides. Toxic plant extracts, such as nicotine from tobacco, were also used. Modern chemistry was used to develop pesticides during World War II. At the time, DDT was hailed as the insecticide to solve all insect problems. Countless other synthetic pesticides were produced. During this time, the modern chemical industry was launched. At relatively low costs, pesticides became a successful primary means of pest control. However, during the 1970s, it became obvious that relying completely on pesticides for pest management could have some negative impacts. It was noticed that when certain pesticides were used repeatedly, some pests were no longer controlled by the pesticide. The pests had developed resistance to the chemical. Since the 1970s, pest resistance has surfaced in weed species, plant pathogens, and insect pests. A prime example is the Colorado potato beetle, which has developed resistance to every major group of insecticides, making the older chemical compounds nearly useless as pest management tools for Colorado potato beetle. In her book, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson discussed environmental concerns about the stability and persistence of DDT and other chlorinated hydrocarbon insecticides. DDT and its relative compounds were also found to be stored in fat cells of insects, fish, birds, rodents, and other animals. DDT didn't break down in fat cells. This is known as bioaccumulation. Some organisms accumulate chemical residues in higher concentrations than those found in their food source. This process is called biomagnification. For example, invertebrates with pesticides in their tissues are eaten by fish, which are then eaten by birds. The birds at the top of the food chain accumulate the highest concentration of pesticide residues. Pesticides that bioaccumulate and biomagnify have been removed from the marketplace. Because of the concerns about environmental impacts, the United States Congress created the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, in 1970. The EPA was given the responsibility to protect the environment and humans from negative impacts associated with pesticide use. One of the first actions taken by EPA was to ban the use of DDT and several related compounds. Since the 70s, Congress has passed other legislation that further restricts pesticide registrations, distribution, and use. Basically, EPA is charged with ensuring that a pesticide label sufficiently protects human and environmental health when the user follows the labeled directions. Let's talk about the principles of pest management now. In the old days, pest management may have meant simply using a pesticide to kill a pest. Due to the economics, environmental concerns, and regulations, pest management today involves a decision-making process and a carefully planned management approach. The first step in any pest management program is making sure you have properly identified the pest. Once the pest is properly identified, the pest manager can study the pest's life cycle, reproductive traits, and its growth habits. Understanding the pest biology is critical when you are developing a pest management plan. Misidentification of the pest can result in ineffective pest management, wasting time and money. We have many types of pests: weeds, insects, fungi, birds, fish, algae, rodents, and plant diseases. For this presentation on pest management, we'll introduce you to the four major pest categories. Weeds are the most commonly targeted pests for control. A weed may compete with your crop, cause an injury on an athletic field, obstruct a roadway or utility power line, or be unwanted for many other reasons. Invertebrate pests include the wide variety of insects like aphids, caterpillars, grubs, and wasps. Invertebrates also include the insect cousins, spiders and mites, sow-bugs and pill-bugs, and snails, slugs, and mussels. Pictured here are a cutworm larva, which is the immature stage of a moth, a plant-feeding mite as seen from under a microscope, and a slug working its way through a backyard lawn. Vertebrate pests include all of those animals with a backbone. These include pest birds, snakes, fish, rodents, and other mammals like mice, rats, raccoons, and deer. Plant diseases are the fourth major category of pests. A plant disease can be caused by disease organisms called pathogens, or they can be caused by non-living agents. Disease pathogens or living agents include fungi, bacteria, viruses, nematodes, and phytoplasmas. These organisms infect plants and often depend on specific host species to survive. Rose mosaic virus symptoms are pictured at the top. The bottom image shows fruiting bodies of the fungus that causes Nectaria twig blight in some fruit and ornamental tree species. It's important to remember that non-living agents, including temperature extremes, air pollution, and a lack of or excess levels of nutrients, can also cause damage to desirable plants, resulting in plant disease. As mentioned earlier, it's important to correctly identify the pest in order to develop an effective management plan. Determining the cause of the problem or identifying the pest may be difficult. Immature stages of weeds and insects may not look at all like the mature stages. Once you have properly identified the pest, learn about its biology. Resources that can help you identify and learn more about pests and host plants include books, extension bulletins, and field guides that contain pictures and biological information. Search the internet. Illustrations of immature pest stages are helpful. Remember, weed seedlings and rosettes often don't resemble mature plants, and caterpillars don't resemble adult moths. If you can't identify the pest, take it to a specialist. When collecting specimens for identification, make sure you collect several specimens and store them in suitable containers. Don't forget to record important specimen information like the host plant and location where the specimen was collected. Pests often leave signs of their presence or damage patterns that provide clues to their identity. Birds and rodents build nests that are often unique to each species. Insects have characteristic feeding damage, such as notching or skeletonizing of leaves, or leaf mining. Rodents and moles dig distinctive burrows in the ground and may leave gnaw marks on tree trunks or other objects. Fecal materials, like the frass from insects, droppings from rodents, or guano from bats, are distinctive. Weeds may have easy-to-identify flowers, seeds, or growth habits. Fungi and other pathogens often cause specific types of plant discoloration, damage, or deformation. Natural controls are out of man's control. Mother Nature dishes these out. They are without a doubt the leading factors that manage pest populations. Natural controls include wind, temperature extremes, humidity levels, and rainfall. A cold snap in the spring or a wet spring can largely reduce insect pest numbers for that season. Rivers, lakes, and mountains provide significant barriers to pest movement and expansion. Naturally occurring predators and pathogens hold down pest populations. The natural food supply of the pest also affects population density. Sometimes natural controls don't provide sufficient suppression of pest numbers. Then we get involved and implement control tactics to reduce the pest populations. Applied controls include biological, mechanical, cultural, physical, genetic, chemical, and regulatory methods. We'll look at each of these applied controls now. Biological control relies on the pest's natural enemies, such as birds, insects, fungi, and viruses. Applied biological control is often directed against pests that are not native to a geographical area. When a non-native pest invades, it often doesn't come with its complement of predators, parasites, and pathogens, so scientists visit the native pest range, usually in Eurasia, and collect the natural enemies. They evaluate the suitability of releasing the natural enemies into areas where the new pest has become established. As the newly released natural enemy population grows, scientists redistribute these beneficial organisms to other sites where the pest has become established. In undisturbed natural areas, forests, rangeland, and other sites, biological control has a good chance of becoming self-sustaining. In other more disturbed sites like landscapes and greenhouses, the pest manager may need to release biocontrol agents regularly. Introduction of biocontrol agents is strictly controlled because of the concern for the biocontrol agent to run amok. There are several instances where introduced biocontrol agents have become pests themselves, like the cane toad in Australia. Again, depending on the establishment level of biocontrol agents, periodic releases may be required in natural areas, greenhouses, landscapes, and agriculture. Any person considering a pesticide application should assess the population of beneficial organisms to determine if an application is necessary. Your management plan should be designed to conserve the natural enemies. Environmental modifications, such as planting cover crops and ground covers, may enhance natural enemy populations. If you have predatory or parasitic insects present, be very careful and selective in the type of insecticide you use. Broad-spectrum insecticides often kill natural enemies. Some selective insecticides won't harm beneficials. Consider non-chemical control options to ensure conservation of the natural enemies. Mechanical control is everyone's favorite. Stomp or squash that bug. Mechanical control involves using devices, machines, or other physical methods to reduce pest populations. You may also use mechanical means to alter the environment so that it's unsuitable for pests to survive. Cultivation is one of the more common forms of mechanical control. Hoes, plows, discs, mowers, cultivators, and bed conditioners are all mechanical devices that physically disrupt soil conditions. If you disturb the soil, you can manage certain types of weeds, germinating weed seeds, and soil insects. Mowing can suppress certain types of weeds and destroy others. Exclusion is the use of a device that blocks the entry of pests into a specific area. This may be a screen on a window to keep out mosquitoes, or caulking to keep rodents and ants out of structures. Sealing cracks and crevices keeps insects, rodents, bats, and birds out of buildings. Metal tree collars can keep squirrels from climbing trees, and sticky material painted onto trees, posts, and wires provides a barrier that many insect pests won't cross. Using sharp objects on roosting areas prevents birds from congregating. Certain rodent and insect pests may be successfully managed with trapping. The trap may consist of a holding device like a snare or leg hold trap. Some traps capture live animals for relocation or euthanasia. Traps that have a sticky surface don't allow the insects or rodents that come into contact with them to escape. Cultural controls alter the environment in which the pest lives. The environment may be changed so it is unfavorable for the pest, or the environment may be altered so the host plant grows more healthfully and is less susceptible to attack by the pest. For example, when turf is managed properly through mowing, irrigation, aeration, and fertilization, it's less likely to have weed, insect, or disease problems. Mulching in a landscape bed prevents light penetration and greatly reduces weed seed germination. Selecting crop cultivars or landscape plants that are not susceptible to pest pressures is a key factor in preventive pest control. Simply by changing planting dates, you may significantly reduce pest problems. The pest may emerge prior to the host plant being present. It dies off and then the crop germinates. Or you may plant early to get the crop a head start so it can outcompete the pest. In agriculture, use of crop rotation and trap crops can reduce the pest pressure on your crops. A pest cannot survive if it doesn't have food, water, and shelter. Practicing sanitation reduces the source of the pest, or it eliminates food and water sources. If you have infected plant residues, they must be removed from the site and destroyed. Weedy areas near buildings, crop fields, or landscapes provide areas for pests to hide. If rodents and some insects have access to food, like manure or garbage cans, they'll be present and reproduce. Having soil near siting provides habitat for certain structural pests. Learn about the habits of your key pests. Evaluate your area for places where sanitation can be effective in reducing pest numbers. Physical control is the altering of the physical environment, changing humidity, temperature, airflow, water, and light. Managing a pest may be as straightforward as pruning landscape plants for increased airflow and light penetration. More air movement and light in a plant's canopy reduces the amount of free moisture present and makes it unfavorable for pathogens. Lowering humidity and temperatures in stored grains prevents mold and insect infestations. Increasing air circulation in structures suppresses wood rot caused by fungal growth. Bright lights in attics are used to deter bats. Plant breeding and selecting resistant crop or landscape cultivars can prevent pest problems. This is true for livestock as well. Traditional breeding programs select for characteristics that prevent attack by diseases and parasites. Genetic manipulation is becoming more common to acquire plants that tolerate pest presence or crops and turf that can tolerate herbicide treatments. Chemical control can be important to any IPM program when used as a preventive or curative method. A pesticide is defined as any material that's applied to plants, the soil, water, harvested crops, structures, clothing and furnishings, or animals to kill, attract, repel, or regulate or interrupt the growth and mating of pests, or to regulate plant growth. The broad category of chemicals termed pesticides includes disinfectants, fungicides, herbicides, insecticides, nematicides, repellents, defoliants, and desiccants. Unfortunately, people sometimes use the term pesticide and insecticides as synonyms, when in fact an insecticide is only one type of pesticide. Pesticides can be quite effective, quick-acting, and relatively easy to use. Pesticides vary in how they work to actually control the pest. We call this the mode of action, how they kill or control the pest. Some pesticides are systemic and actually move through animal or plant tissues, and the pest encounters it when feeding on the animal or plant. Other pesticides work by contact action, like battery acid on your pants. You must make sure that you apply the material so that it comes into direct contact with the pest. Pesticides also vary in their selectivity, or how many different pest species they target. Some affect all related organisms equally and are called non-selective. A good example is glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup Original. Glyphosate is non-selective when applied to green plants. Any green plant that gets a sufficient dose will die, whether it's a broadleaf or a grass plant. In contrast, a selective pesticide only kills a small group of related organisms and does not harm others. The herbicide 2,4-D is a good example. It only kills broadleaf plants and does not harm grass plants when applied according to labeled directions. Persistence is the term used for how long a pesticide remains present in the environment. DDT, which is no longer used, was a very persistent insecticide that's still found in the environment today. Many of the new products break down in a matter of hours or a few weeks. There are some persistent materials on the market today. We call them residual insecticides and herbicides and use them where we want long-term control. Applications of residual herbicides are made to rights of way, so repeated applications are not required throughout the year. Non-residual materials are also available. They break down very quickly. The government uses several regulatory control programs to manage pests. Quarantines are used at airports and ocean ports to prevent entry of foreign pests. State borders and areas within states may be under a quarantine status to prevent the movement of pests from an infected area. Nursery stock and other plant material may be regulated to ensure no pests are transported on plant material. Federal and state governmental agencies may be involved in small to very large-scale eradication programs, with the goal being the total elimination of a pest from a defined area. Regulatory mosquito abatement districts and programs are established to manage for large-scale public health concerns. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, is a decision-based management style that implements a balanced tactical approach. The decision-making is based on planning to anticipate damage to prevent it from occurring, and if damage thresholds are met, using a variety of control tactics to suppress the pest population. When using a decision-based system, you increase effectiveness and reduce the negative side effects. IPM is dependent on proper identification and understanding of the pest biology, along with proper measurement of population densities and assessment of control tactics. The shift from using only a single control tactic to IPM provides for a more balanced ecosystem, since factors other than damage alone are part of the decision-making. We know that continued use of pesticides without thought to resistance management and effects on the environment can result in the product becoming less effective. Using IPM promotes a healthy environment, and it saves you money over time. Management is decision-based. Once the pest is identified and its biology reviewed, assess the amount of damage you can tolerate. In some cases, this may be the presence of only one pest organism. In others, you may be able to tolerate hundreds of individuals. Next, set your goal for control. Are there strategies you can use to prevent the pest from becoming a problem? Can you tolerate to just knock the pest population back a little, suppress it, or do you actually need total elimination or eradication of the pest organism? This may depend on agricultural markets or a customer's demand for a pest-free environment. When selecting management tactics, most specifically when selecting pesticides, consider pesticide resistance. Is it wise to go back and treat with the same chemical that you have used the last few treatments? Or should you change product types? Ultimately, you'll want to consider the cost to your pocketbook and the impacts on the environment. Here are the major factors that drive the decision-making within an IPM program. First and always foremost is pest identification and understanding. Once you know what, when, and where about the pest, you can develop a monitoring system using several survey techniques. You need to set your management goal and decide what level of control is acceptable for your situation. A golf green will have a different goal than a fairway. Once you set your goals and understand the pest, you can look at the factors that impact your selection of control tactics. These factors may include timing, economics, environmental considerations, and regulatory constraints. Don't forget to evaluate the entire process and record your findings. You can then tweak the plan in future years once you understand your successes and failures. Pest identification is critical. It's the most important step. You must know what pest is causing the problem or what pest may potentially cause a problem. Often, an insect or plant may be present, but it poses no threat whatsoever and requires no action. Some may even be beneficial organisms. Once you have identified the pest, take some time investigating its classification and life cycle. They are key to mechanical, cultural, and chemical management options. Knowing the stage of the pest that overwinters may provide a key as to the timing for control measures to be taken. Investigation is critical to understand what pest population levels trigger concern and what levels trigger action. Having some knowledge of the pest and its environmental needs may shed light on what population levels may be anticipated due to the environmental conditions. Did the cold winter knock the population back? Did the early warm spring allow for another generation to be produced? Knowledge of the life cycle may provide the key to timing your control activities to the pest's most vulnerable stage. Using the concept of key hosts and key pests is a good way to start your IPM planning. Know what crop you are growing or what landscape plants you have growing or plan to grow. Do some reading and go to some seminars to learn what pests are the most common and most damaging for the plants you grow. Know what to look for and when to monitor. What symptoms does the plant express when the pest feeds on it? Can you recognize them? What symptoms does the plant express when it's infected by a disease? What do the common and not so common beneficial predators and parasites look like that are associated with the pest? Other than the key pests, have a working knowledge of the occasional pests that appear every so often, such as an ant infestation. Their appearance may depend on the weather or even your use of chemicals. Be aware that when you suppress the key pest, another low-level pest may become very problematic. We call these secondary pests. For example, if you manage for codling moth in apples with a broad-spectrum insecticide, the insecticide will kill beneficial predatory mites as well. This sets you up for an explosion of the secondary plant-feeding spider mites. If you have a working knowledge of the pest, you can learn about scouting and trapping techniques. Some scouting is dependent on weather data, since growth of pest populations depends on temperature. Several factors will play into the decision when evaluating the trigger levels for control action. These may be based on the economics of lost yield and harvest costs, or they may be simply based on aesthetics. You have to know the answer to the question, how many pest numbers need to be present before control action is warranted? The action threshold is that pest number that triggers you to initiate corrective measures. Those corrective measures may be mechanical, cultural, or chemical. In agriculture, the action threshold is usually well defined based on economics. Depending on the pest species, the site, or even the season, the trigger level may differ. At 6 aphids on a wheat plant, the plants can tolerate the feeding and the loss of yield does not approach the cost to control the aphids. However, Once the aphid population builds to 15 aphids per plant, it makes good economic sense to take action to hold down your losses. In agriculture, we base these action triggers on economics. The economic threshold is when the pest population reaches a specific density that causes significant damage, and if not held in check, economic injury will be realized. Economic injury is a threshold of pest number just above the economic threshold. At this point, the cost of control and the cost of damage are equal. If you did not start control measures at the lower economic threshold, you will end up with damage that exceeds the costs of control. For turf, ornamentals, and even public health, we simply call the threshold an action threshold. Ask yourself, at what point does the cost of control ward off future expenses or unacceptable damage levels? If you manage turf on a golf course green, your tolerance for weeds is very different than for weed levels in the fairways, and your action threshold is different. You need to set a goal. Prevention is an important goal. During your planning period for crop production or prior to seeding or establishing an ornamental bed or turf grass, consider what actions you can employ to prevent pests from becoming established. Consider planting certified weed-free seed or use resistant plant cultivars. Build exclusionary devices to keep pests out. If you had a previous infestation, consider sanitation measures to remove infected source material. You may even want to consider some preventive pesticide treatments like using treated seed or using a pre-emergence herbicide application. Again, prior to the growing season, set your pest management goal. Do you require total elimination of the pest, or would just suppressing the population offer sufficient protection? There are many tactics you can consider to hold a population in check. If your goal is eradication, you'll have to develop a very intense, methodical plan to ensure the total elimination of the species and all of its life stages. Eradication is typically a goal when you have a very small, contained pest population, or when the government is managing the program and they can employ wide-scale control activities on properties of private citizens. Always follow these steps before implementing an IPM program. Identify the pest and set up a monitoring program. Know the economic or action threshold as well as the economic injury level. Consider the available management options. Evaluate the benefits and risks of each method. And make sure your control strategy falls in step with any regulations. A very important step in any IPM program is record keeping and evaluation of your efforts. Keep track of climatic conditions. Record when and where actions were taken. Track the pest populations. Near the end of the season, review your records. Some control strategies may not be quick acting, but may prove effective given sufficient time. Other management strategies may have caused negative impacts that need to be considered when making future decisions. When you look to chemicals as a management option, there are several considerations. First, make sure you have identified the pest. Make certain that the product you select is effective against the pest and is labeled for the site. If you have had a continual problem with a pest, your decision on a chemical may be slightly different than if you are targeting a new invasive pest. If you have used chemicals in the past to treat a pest population, consider using an alternative type of product to reduce the possibility of pesticide resistance. If you keep using the same product type repeatedly year in and year out, resistance will likely develop. Make sure you read the label carefully to understand the timing for the application, and make sure you use the correct application rate. Using a dose that is over the label rate is illegal and can cause significant impacts. For example, using too much of a selective herbicide may result in damage to your crop or turf. Making an application with too low of a dose or at the wrong time can be a waste of money. With an IPM plan, you must keep your eyes open. Pay attention to all factors that contribute to pest populations. Be knowledgeable about the pest and the various management options you can employ when necessary. Be a professional, be smart, be careful, and be accurate. We've talked a little bit about pesticide resistance. Let's look at this phenomena that is a concern whether applying insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, or any type of pesticide. Anytime you apply a pesticide, not all of the individuals in that population will be killed and removed. 1 in a million may resist the treatment. That 1 in a million is not obvious to the pest manager the first few years, but after repeated applications and the reproduction of the resistant individuals, a population of resistant pests becomes apparent. The chemical that historically controlled that population is now ineffective. If you use products that have similar modes of action, those resistant individuals will not be controlled. So alternate between chemicals having different modes of action to manage for resistance. If pesticides are frequently applied during a growing season, resistance can show up more quickly. Chemicals that are persistent tend to have resistance show up more readily than products that don't remain active over time. The pest biology is also a key factor. If the pest has a high rate of reproduction and reproduces often, those resistant individuals show up more quickly as the population of those individuals increases. Also, pests that have many offspring per generation tend to have a greater chance of resistance developing. Again, to manage for pesticide resistance, alternate your chemicals and don't use pesticides with similar modes of action repeatedly. Break the cycle. Instead of treating an entire block, consider leaving an untreated section to allow those susceptible individuals to reproduce to keep the susceptible gene pool present. Using lower doses may increase survivorship. If you use pesticides that are highly selective with specific modes of action, there's an increased concern for resistance management. Again, use alternate modes of action to break the cycle. You can also use other methods of control to break the cycle and kill off the resistant individuals. Let's summarize what you need to have learned from this presentation. Use a carefully planned, decision-based integrated pest management plan, if at all possible. In order to manage any pest, it must be properly identified and its life cycle and biology understood. Monitoring for pest populations is important. The presence of a pest does not necessarily mean you must start control measures. You must know what your action threshold is, whether it's based on economics or aesthetic values. At the end of the season and even throughout the season, evaluate your pest management decisions. If using any pesticide, manage for pesticide resistance. And with any control method, use good judgment to avoid any harmful impact to humans, wildlife, or the environment. Question 1. Which of the following are legally classified as pesticides? 1. Insecticides. 2. Nematicides. 3. Growth regulators. 4. Disinfectants. Select the correct answer. A. 1 only. B. 1 and 2 only. C. 1, 2, and 4 only. D. 1, 2, 3, and 4. The correct answer is D. Any product that claims to control, repel, or otherwise mitigate a pest is legally classified as a pesticide and must be registered by EPA. Question 2. You have used a selective herbicide to manage a weed infestation. You are concerned that the weeds are herbicide resistant. What tactic should you consider to control resistant weeds? 1. Use a herbicide with a different mode of action. 2. Use cultivation strategies to manage the weed. 3. Use the same herbicide but apply at double the highest label rate. 4. Mix in a spreader sticker with the same herbicide and apply using smaller droplets to achieve better coverage. Select the correct answer. A. 1 and 2 only. B. 2 and 3 only. C. 1 and 4 only. D. 2 and 4 only. The correct answer is A. Question 3. Following are two scenarios that employ the same pest control strategy. 1. Draining standing water to manage for mosquitoes. 2. Closing garbage lids to eliminate food access by rodents. What type of pest control strategy was employed? Select 1. A. Exclusion. B. Sanitation. C. Biological. D. Mechanical. The correct answer is B. Sanitation. This presentation was authored by Carol Ramsey, Carrie Foss, Becky Hines, and Brett Johnson of Washington State University, Urban IPM, and Pesticide Safety Education. In addition to sources noted on the image, graphics were provided by the following sources: Nevada Department of Agriculture, University of Missouri-Lincoln, Virginia Tech, Washington Department of Agriculture, and Washington State University. The presentation material was reviewed by Ed Crow, Maryland Department of Agriculture, Jeannie Kasai, U.S. EPA, Beth Long, University of Tennessee, and Susan Whitney King, University of Delaware. Narration was provided by Carrie Foss, Washington State University, Urban IPM, and Pesticide Safety Education Program.